If you're thinking about starting the CPA exam, the cost isn't just the exam fee you'll see quoted online. By the time you factor in application fees, a review course, and the other costs that come up along the way, the real number is usually a lot higher than people expect going in. This video breaks down what the CPA exam actually costs in 2026 piece by piece. Let's start with the number most people already know about: the exam fee itself. NASBA sets a recommended per section fee, and depending on when your state adopted the current rate in 2026, that's somewhere between $262 and $268 per section. Multiply that across all 4 sections, and you're looking at roughly $1,050 to $1,075 if you pass everything on your first attempt. That number is fairly consistent across states since NASBA sets the baseline. But this is just the exam fee. It's the smallest and most predictable piece of the total cost, not the full picture. On top of the exam fee, every state board charges its own application and registration fees, and this is where costs start to vary more depending on where you're applying. The application or education evaluation fee, which confirms you're eligible to sit for the exam, typically runs somewhere between $50 and $400, depending on your state. Registration fees, charged per section in most states, usually fall between $10 and $150. Once you add these state-level fees on top of the NASBA exam fee, most candidates end up with total mandatory fees somewhere between $1,100 and $1,400 for all 4 sections. That range is wide because it depends heavily on which state you're applying through. This is where the real cost variation comes in, and it's the single biggest line item most candidates will pay. Commercial review courses, the ones most people use to actually study for the exam, typically range from $1,000 to $4,000 or more, depending on the provider and the package you choose. What you're paying for varies a lot: practice questions, video lectures, adaptive study technology, and how long you get access to the materials. On the lower end, self-study or independent resources can run far cheaper, sometimes just a few $100s, though they usually come with less structure and support than a full commercial course. This is the piece of your total budget you actually have the most control over. A few costs tend to catch people off guard because they're not part of the headline number most sources quote. Most states require an ethics exam in addition to the 4 CPA exam sections, which can run up to a few $100s depending on the provider. Once you pass everything, there's a licensing fee to actually get your license issued, typically somewhere between $50 and $400, depending on your state. If you fail a section and need to retake it, you're paying that section's exam fee again in full, which is part of why picking a realistic order and studying thoroughly the first time matters financially, not just academically, and if you're testing internationally. There are additional surcharges on top of the standard fees. Putting it all together, mandatory exam-related fees alone typically land somewhere between $1,100 and $1,400. Once you add a review course, the realistic total for most candidates climbs to somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 or more, depending heavily on which course you choose. Retakes, rescheduling fees, and delays can push that number higher if things don't go smoothly. One thing worth checking before you assume you're paying for all of this yourself: a lot of firms, especially larger ones, offer some level of reimbursement for exam fees or review courses once you're hired or once you pass. It's worth asking directly rather than assuming you're covering the full cost out of pocket. The exam fee itself, the number most people search for first, is actually the smallest and most predictable part of the total cost. The real budget variation comes from your review course choice and the state-specific fees layered on top of the base exam fee. Before committing to a course or a study timeline, it's worth budgeting realistically for the full process, rather than just the exam fees. And since fees vary by state and by provider, checking your specific state board's current numbers directly is worth doing before you lock in a plan. That's the real breakdown of what the CPA exam actually costs in 2026, start to finish. If you want more on the CPA exam process and getting into Big 4, more videos are below. Subscribe if this was useful.